Hello, welcome to our channel, where we set out to explore wonderful great works of literature.
While dressed in elegant clothing because...
Why the hell not? Okay, so thank you for joining us this evening. I know it's been a while since our last video, but we've been busy. We've been busy reading
Hilda and Eustace.
Eustace and Hilda by L.P. Hartley.
Yes.
So I should just say, just to begin with, Tartarus Press actually released 2 volumes of ghost stories by L.P. Hartley. And, we will be reviewing a collection of ghost stories. I know it's a little bit late, given that Halloween has just passed. But one of the stories in that collection was an L.P. Hartley ghost story called W.C. And so I ended up getting this collection of 2 volumes. Mm-hmm. And then I wanted to know what else L.P. Hartley was known for. And Eustace and Hilda is actually considered one of his masterpieces. He only had about 2 novels that he completed. The other one that's very well known in the UK is known as the Go-Between. So it also involves like a young boy and sort of kind of getting out into the world and realizing the dynamics of love and relationships and all that stuff.
Yeah. And there's definitely some similarities between Hartley and the main character, Eustace.
Yeah, so we read a little bit of a biographical note on him, and he had a heart problem, just like Eustace, the main character. And he also lived in Venice, which a good portion of the book is actually set in Venice.
The third book, yeah.
The third book, yeah. Mm-hmm. So L.P. Hartley, just so you know, he was born in 1895 and died in 1972. He was the son of a director of a brickworks. He attended Harrow and Balliol College, Oxford, before setting out on a career as a literary critic and writer of short stories. So in 1944, he published the first novel, The Shrimp and the Anemone. And so that's the first book in this collection. She's always impressed that I can actually say anemone very quickly.
Every time I try to say it, I feel like I'm in Finding Nemo. I'm like, anemone.
Yeah. The second volume is called The Sixth Heaven. And the third one takes the title of the full collection, which is Eustace and Hilda. And I think that's all we wanted to say about that so far. Did you want to start it off? Did you want to talk a little bit about... So
we can set the scene a little bit. So, I mean, ultimately, it's not an action-packed type of novel. It's not one that's about adventure in a classic form. It's really more about the evolving and not so evolving a relationship between a brother and sister. So Eustace is the younger brother and Hilda is the older brother. Or older sister, sorry.
So he's 9 and she's
about 13.
Yeah, she's about 13. Mm-hmm. And so this story over a period of 3 books kind of shows the changing dynamic in their relationship, but also shows how even their childhood attachment to one another kind of remains in a way almost like consistent throughout their lives. And I wanted just to say before we start in, he actually has a quote here by Emily Bronte, which says, "I've known 100 kinds of love, all made the loved one rue." Mm-hmm. So almost like regret, I suppose. And this kind of summarizes the book. So Eustace, to get into like Ava was saying, this is a very psychological book. It starts in the Edwardian period. Where there's like a high level of manners and customs and sort of also a strong sense of like social standing and doing sort of the socially acceptable sort of thing. And actually,
class, obviously.
It's very important. Yeah. Class, right? And so L.P. Hartley was like a strong sort of, I would say, non-conformist in a way. He was very critical of just pure conformity for conformity's sake. And so Eustace is a very young, imaginative, very romantic style boy. He kind of lives in his head. He's also so much in his head that he's always very guilt-ridden, very conscientious.
Full of rumination.
A lot of repetitive thoughts, perseverations. And he's always trying to be good, do good, say the right thing, do the right thing. And he does really take it quite on himself very harshly when he sees himself failing in that regard. And the person who would sometimes or oftentimes point that out would be his older sister Hilda.
Yeah.
Did you want to describe Hilda a little bit?
Hilda is old beyond her years,
Yeah.
and I think part of it is that, as we mentioned, their mother passed away, so a lot of responsibility for Hilda at a young age. I think naturally she felt like that was her role to caretake for Eustace, but she also, without the presence of a mother, maybe that was encouraged a lot by the father, who's a little aloof, as well as like both the aunt is in the picture a little bit, who's very strict, also aloof. So partially she took it upon her own shoulders to be kind of his person who guides, or governess.
You almost said like
in
a governess,
way.
Right?
Yeah. She always is teaching him school, which is interesting. They never hired a governess. Oh, they did hire a governess, I think, for the kids.
They have a caretaker.
But there's a lot of scenes of her really teaching him lessons of morality, and also lessons literally in school. But beyond that, her personality is also very less childlike. It's very domineering, serious, cares about the health of her brother to a point of overbearing. Yeah. Like, she's always present in telling him which way to be and which way not to be. Well, that's interesting that you say that, because I think it leaves a lot for the audience to interpret. I don't think necessarily L.P. Hartley describes her as stifling in any way, and there's elements of like perhaps where you as the reader might see that, or it depends on your personality really, and who you and that's part of the beauty of the story. It's really, who do you relate more with? I think if you had a personality that was really had to care for people, or was always very mature and carried a lot of the weight of the world and saw the seriousness of the world, and when we're not carefree, when we are carefree, what can happen, the consequence of that. I think Hilda was very aware of that at a young age, and maybe saw her brother's shortcomings, both because she had to, both because she was loving and protective, but also part of it was her personality and she's good at it, right? She's a very highly intelligent young lady.
And L.P. Hartley is a very subtle writer, so he wouldn't ever take sides. He definitely showed them, all the characters are very sympathetically written, I think. And he very much just allows you to read or to project yourself, let's say, in your own belief systems and thoughts onto the characters. He called himself a moralizer or a moralist in his writings, but he never hit you over the head with it. So it gives a lot of wiggle room for you for your interpretation, which is really wonderful.
In a way, it shows like both the beauty and the shortcoming of both dramatically different types of personality. Like one who, in a way, is very dependent naturally, wants to be guided, doesn't want to be independent in thought and independent in the way he moves in the world. He really, like Eustace, really depends on other people, both to tell him what is right and wrong. Even if he does have an idea, he always depends on other people to really tell him what direction.
What to do.
Whereas Hilda is the complete opposite. She does not like being told what to do. She has her own path. She has a very strong idea of what's right or wrong.
Yeah.
And moves through this world somewhat independently, but at the same time she's weirdly dependent on Eustace to be the person who the person who she does guide. And when she doesn't have that, when she doesn't have someone to guide, she equally becomes lost. And whereas Eustace if he doesn't have someone to guide him and tell him what to do, he becomes lost. So there is an intercodependent relationship.
Absolutely. And that codependence really comes out in the first sort of main, I would say, symbolic scene of the first book, which is the shrimp in the anemone. And so Eustace, I just wanted to highlight this part because I think it's important for the rest of the story, because it all kind of pivots on this one scene, and the book in a way ends kind of around this one scene, this type of imagery. And so Eustace and his sister like to play by the waterfront, on the sands, and by the rocky shore there. And they create these little tidal pools of water, and they create little fortifications around it. So they have like some fun doing that together. And one day by the rocks, Eustace sees that there's a shrimp being consumed and digested by a sea anemone. And he's quite distressed, and he's anxious, and he's horrified by this scene. And he really wants to do something. He wants to help this the shrimp. So he calls his sister over, and she sees it. And what she does is essentially, I believe, she just pulls them apart. She doesn't really think twice about it. She just intervenes and kind of like does the thing that she feels is the right thing to do. And Eustace is horrified because
the right thing. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
The right thing, but also the thing that she thinks will be the best for Eustace. So
Right.
she's not concerned
she's
about
not
the
concerned.
suffering
Yeah.
of these two creatures.
Yeah.
Eustace is very distressed by it, and I think this is again was an act of protection for him. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been touched, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's an important element
That's
because
true.
that. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no. So essentially, she pulls them apart, and rather than saving the shrimp dies, as well as the sea anemone that was trying to eat it. And so we end up with a very tragic conclusion to that, where both creatures succumb.
Yeah, and in trying to intervene and help, it ends up kind of
Catastrophic.
both little creatures.
Yeah, and so to loop back to the end of the story. Obviously, I'm sure based on what we're telling you, you can kind of put it together yourselves. But Eustace is essentially that shrimp, and the sea anemone is it's like Hilda in a way, right? So it's symbolic of their relationship with one another, that codependence, and almost like the sense of if there's a tearing up between the two of them, neither of them could survive that rupture of that relationship. And rather than going into so much incredible detail, because this is a very long book, it's 3 volumes. I just wanted to say, we could highlight certain key parts, but
yeah, there's some twists of fate that you're like, oh, will this change either of their personalities? But ultimately, throughout all 3 books, the personalities just become a little bit more adult-like, but not necessarily the elements that make them the core description of who they were as children remain prevalent throughout all 3 books. I think that's important. But there's a few other key kind of people and characters come in who shake it up a bit, and it makes you wonder, okay, will they finally like slightly change
course,
it's
change
not
their personality.
Yeah, and I think like at least Eustace's character is somewhat aware of his shortcomings, maybe more so than Hilda.
Yeah. At least we get more of his
perspective. Things. We don't really see as much of Hilda and her perspective throughout. That's true. But ultimately, like the main characters who kind of come in and out is in the beginning. There's a Mrs. Fothergill.
Yeah. Fothergill.
Do you want to?
So I guess she's an older woman. She has no dependents. She's got no heirs or heiresses, and so she's rather wealthy.
And disabled. She had a stroke.
Yeah, she had a stroke, and her hands are gnarled or something. There's something about her hands that she always keeps concealed, and all the children in town just assume that she's some sort of like witch of some sort, right? So,
as cruel children will be.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, so essentially, Hilda insists that Eustace kind of like she tells him to help out pushing the bath chair of Miss Fothergill. And so anyway, they end up sparking. Of course, Eustace doesn't like this idea at first, but then all this sort of drama happens. He's anxious about it. But soon she invites him for tea, and Miss Fothergill and Eustace, just the two of them, spark this wonderful friendship with this older woman who kind of like acts as some sort of a guide. We don't know too much about the details of their friendship, but they like to play cards together. They like to chat with one another. Eustace is one of these little boys, right? Who loves
and Miss Fothergill picks up on his like neuroticies. She picks up that he's very people pleasing, and so she says, one of the best things you did was because at one point he skipped in the very beginning, seeing Mrs. Fothergill and went and played with another little girl and became really sick. And she said that was probably one of the best things he ever did for himself was ignore what other people said. So she kind of tried to instill
this idea
of maybe he needs a bit more push into independence than his parents and upbringing are allowing. And especially
his sister. His sister's control as well.
Yeah.
Is strong, right?
And like prior to the relationship with Miss Fothergill, Eustace was even more babied, even more like sheltered and like they never really gave him any sort of idea that he had any inner compass or strength. They
Yeah.
really played up his weaknesses.
Yeah, because he had a weak heart, right?
But also, like, morally, they're just like, you never know what to do, you never study, even though he's incredibly smart. Other than Minnie, the nanny, or the nursemaid, or whatever she was, who's very, like, saw his beautiful characteristics.
Yeah, they infantilized him quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, he was a child, but it never really seemed to end.
Yeah, it never ended, even as he got older.
Yeah.
So, just to fast forward a little bit, just to show you, so unexpectedly he gets an inheritance when Miss Fothergill dies, and she leaves quite a legacy for him, and it's about £18,000, which was quite a considerable sum. So at the time, his family come from like a middling class, and there was no expectation that they would go to higher education or to like Eton College or one of these sort of special schools for the elite. And of course now he can afford to go, and so can his sister. She ends up going to a girls' school very close by, and so they kind of get on this trajectory because of this unexpected inheritance from Mrs. Fothergill, and essentially are more so Eustace propelled into high society, propelled into a world of titles and
all
aristocrats.
of a sudden friends. Like, he had no other playmate other than Hilda.
Yeah.
Because the parents refused to send him to school because they could only afford a poor school, but they didn't, like a lower class school, but they didn't want him to go to a lower class school.
Yeah.
So he literally, Hilda and him had no friends really other than kind of this one Nancy Steptoe. So this was huge for him, and he was clearly a very social little guy. Or a big guy by then.
Yeah.
But,
So Hilda's very ambitious as well. I would say even more so than Eustace. Very intelligent. She's also incredibly pretty. They emphasize that quite a bit. But so what happens is, fast forwarding through the first book and starting with the second one, essentially what happens, it starts end of World War I. It's already been completed. Of course, she's finished her education. He's still at Oxford. Hilda ends up being almost like a director for a clinic that she set up, like a hospital for children who are crippled children, right? And so she takes her job incredibly seriously. She devotes all of her attentions and energies almost
and she does well at
exclusively
it.
There.
Like the clinic really becomes almost infamous. Like it's
in a good way.
Yeah, like in a good way, meaning there's like lots of newspaper articles on her and how she's really helped to help that clinic to flourish through her, in a way, domineering. Like, she made a lot of enemies, but she got a lot done.
Yeah, she's a real
everyone else
go-getter.
kind of lollygagged around and didn't get anything done, and she even put some of Eustace's money into the clinic.
Yeah.
So he donated some of that money.
Yeah. And so from the first book, there was some sort of a thing where Eustace was, Eva alluded to this, where Eustace went off with a girl and they got sick because they got lost and a storm came. And a young boy named Dick Stavely, who's a little bit older than Eustace, ends up rescuing him. And this is actually a big, old family. They date, their descendants from knights in the 14th century. So this old aristocratic, very wealthy family live just down the street in their small seaside town. And this relationship starts to blossom between sort of their family and Eustace. And Hilda and Eustace kind of like recruits Hilda against her own better judgments and wishes to come by this Anchorstone Hall and to befriend these people that he's gotten to know through his connections. And so their child, who was always pursued Hilda, Dick Stavely, is a bit of a rakish cad, but he's a very heroic type figure, very action oriented. He did time in Arabia, doing some sort of military campaign or whatever.
Wouldn't you say he's kind of like the stereotype of a spoiled rich kid who, like, doesn't really understand, like, he understands the value of money to a degree, but he doesn't understand the idea of having to work for it?
But I don't think I don't think that's necessarily fair. I think he doesn't care much for money, I don't think. I think he's all about the adventure.
That's it.
Like, I can see him as being like a Lawrence of Arabia type person who'd go out, but more ego driven perhaps. I don't know very much about
but doesn't really value education.
Right, yeah.
He says that
he's a hunter.
He went around and did pranks at Oxford.
Yeah.
Like, I just mean in that way, like,
oh yeah, okay.
Whereas Eustace felt like he had to study harder, got all these scholarships, like really felt like he had to uphold kind of the title that was given to him and the opportunity, and then Dick was just like pranking away his time.
I think he's more like that old school like hunting sort of British nobility where they just wanted to do fox hunts and
that's what I mean by
exercises and like motor cars and all that jazz, right? Mm-hmm. So he's more of a rougher around the edges character despite his title and his
or like foolish, prankish, jovial character.
So they're just one of the highlights of the second book is Dick Stavely somehow convinces Hilda to go on this airplane that he has like this little special airplane that he takes around the grounds, and they end up going together by themselves for hours and hours, and Eustace...
Way past the time they said.
Yeah, and Eustace and the entire family are worried sick, like almost like dinner is over, it's evening, they still haven't arrived from this trip, which should have taken probably an hour or two, and very distressing, and they both come back kind of like a little bit perturbed, and we don't exactly know what transpired, what happened. Did he propose to her? Did he try to come on to her?
Did he just like do foolish things and she lectured him? Like, we have no idea what happened.
We have no idea. And so a lot of the strangeness happens in the sort of the reader is also in the dark as to what really transpired that night, that evening. So these strange I guess like back and forth happens. But one of the ladies in attendance at this party is Lady Nellie, and she's the aunt. She's Dick's aunt. And she's like a very sophisticated, elegant, cultivated woman, and everybody loves her. She's kind of like, in a way, kind of the spirit, the heart of the party. She always knows what to say, the right time to say it.
There's moving in the right circles, but also at the same time has like eccentric friends who are like kind of this outside of the etiquette, which...
Yeah, and she kind of does things her own way when she wants it. She doesn't sort of like dance to anyone's tune but her own, right? Mm-hmm. And so she invites Eustace to Venice. And, we don't quite know. He's very, Elke Hartley is very subtle, right? So you don't know what she really intended for, like, what was it? Was she just inviting him just to be nice, just to be, formal?
There's also rumors that she's kind of has these lovers on the side.
She was a bit adventurous woman.
Like, was that intended? We don't really know.
Right.
Was it ever really meant for him to come? Or if he did go, was he only meant to stay a short while but didn't know the etiquette? And he
clearly overstayed his welcome. He stayed there for months at her place in Venice. And
kind of like him for that.
Yeah. And so, but like, there was, this expectation that, he would be her plaything, but he's very innocent. So clearly he wouldn't have even been able to read the line between the lines. And he's very asexual. Like, there's nothing about him that's sort of like,
shows that he's even interested in anyone, really, other than friendship and pleasing people.
Exactly. And so he stays for quite a while, and then he ends up writing a book, really like at the behest of Lady Nellie, because she says to him, like, she kind of creates a fib that somehow he's busy with her at her place in Venice, in her palazzo, because he's writing a book.
Yeah, so that was the way that he could move in the circle with her, was if he had some sort of adventurous or like interesting part about him. So,
or also an excuse probably as to why else would she have him with her.
There. Yeah, right, exactly.
Like a pretext.
So they said he was an author, but then Eustace took it upon himself to really become an author.
Yeah, so he was like, okay, well, everyone keeps telling me I should leave the party at this time because I have to write my book. And he's like, I don't have a book to write, but maybe I'll start writing one.
Yeah, like he just gets so stressed. I just empathize with the character so much because it's like he's always worried about somehow disappointing people. So he's like, maybe I'm not supposed to write a book, but I can't lie about it. Like this idea that lying and morality are really bad things. So he has this kind of like Hilda in the back of his head with everything he does. And so he's like, okay, well, I guess I should write a book. So he does.
Yeah. And he creates a few blunders where he purchases like a beautiful dress, a red dress for Hilda for a party at the Staveleys. And, now at this point, Hilda is more enamored, let's say, with Dick, and she's more a number at the party. But because of her beauty and her sort of her stubbornness and her nature, I suppose, her disposition, she's always a little bit rubs people the wrong way, especially in those circles, I would say.
Which is, I think, why Dick liked her in the first part, is what he described is that she seemed like she's very independent.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he thought that,
Yeah.
like, that's why he loved her, and
Yeah.
and he thought that that's who she was in all of its the sense of the word. He didn't realize how attached she actually is.
Yeah. So essentially, like, inadvertently, Eustace creates a little bit of a scandal. He always hears, kind of like, because he's in Venice now, relaxing, he hears just through newspaper clippings or through letters from different sources, different people, different witnesses, kind of like piecemeal what's actually happening with Hilda.
Meanwhile, he's like spending his fortune, by the way, paying like all these gondoliers, like
outrageous, over tipping them and stuff.
Outrageous, like even more than like a lady would pay. He's like he gets this pleasure out of pleasing people so much that he'll go overboard and like basically like just blowing his money.
And it was interesting. I found this like one scene very interesting where the two gondoliers, there's like two gentlemen who always kind of like attend Lady Nellie, and Eustace is obviously using their services as well, and he tips them both very handsomely, but both of them have incredibly polar opposite reactions. One is like effusive in thanks and like, wow, sir, thank you so much. This is wonderful, wonderful. And the other one gets insulted. Actually, is insulted that he's giving him this much money, right? Mm-hmm. So it shows the ambivalent nature of Eustace's conscience and his sense of like do-goodiness, like
he doesn't really fully understand what pleases people.
And he doesn't understand money because he inherited it and he didn't really have to really earn it for himself, and he wasn't raised in a household that had a lot of money to begin with. So he doesn't even have necessarily a disdain for money. He's still very dependent on it, but he doesn't know how to use it.
I think that's the part where like that's the only thing that really changed people's perception of him. So as soon as he had money from Mrs. Fothergill, then all of a sudden he had this respect he never was given before.
Yeah.
And so I think he's constantly trying to evoke that with 4 other people.
Yeah.
In a way, like give them that same, because I'm not sure if he ever really feels like it is his money.
No, I don't think he does.
I don't think he ever really gets attached to the idea that it's his, and so he almost in a way feels guilty for having it.
And like the moment he assumed that Hilda was having trouble at the clinic, he just wrote her a quick note for transferring £1,000, like almost like the last of his money he was willing to just throw at Hilda and her clinic just to save her or to help her. So anyway, it was very interesting. So it leads us now into the 3rd book where some crisis happens with Hilda. She ends up getting into some sort of paralysis, and she ends up becoming sort of wheelchair bound, and she's almost in a catatonic state, mute, completely.
They say it's all like psychological in nature, that some sort of psychologically stressful event happened.
With Dick, I think, is the assumption, right?
Yeah, the assumption is Dick.
And
because it all comes to a head when he proposes to another woman.
The one he loved before, the one who...
He didn't really love her ever.
Yeah.
He just says that she's a stable character, knows how to handle him, kind of thing. So, anyway, he ends up proposing to someone other than Hilda, and I think that's really what caused this catastrophe.
Really like departs back to Arabia. Like he kind of like
takes
leaves.
off,
So she's kind of completely traumatized by this. And so...
she's afraid of also being seen as a fallen woman, right? This is someone who's very morally, like, conscious.
Yeah.
And again, pretends that she doesn't care what other people think, but really does deep down.
I'm sure.
Yeah,
and so Eustace ends up coming back to their family home, and he ends up taking care of her, and really almost it seemed like a strange twist of fate where now she's Miss Fothergill, Hilda, in the bath chair, and Eustace is like the nursemaid who's just pushing her through the cliffs. And he comes up with a weird plan to somehow frighten her by pushing the wheelchair close to the edge.
Like he's going to push her off the edge.
Well, no, but like almost like having her frightened into a sensibility again. And he really so he tries to do something like this. And I don't know, there was this like weird, strange sort of encounter, and it does work. But then it gets Hilda to think, oh my God, was he actually trying to kill me? Like, were you really trying to push me off? But he quickly, of course, like...
Anyway, but it wakes her out of this...
Wakes her out of that stupor
eventually. Yeah. But during that process, what's really fascinating is this is where, when he's in Venice, and he has this, like, very sacred ritual bath, which we forgot to mention.
Oh, yeah, that was wonderful,
where he doesn't even really want to go bathing, but anyway, in his anxious ways... He brought his bathing suit and always has his like pockets full of stuff to like take places in case of an emergency, which I just find very cute. and endearing. And so everyone's teasing him that he has this bathing suit, and then it's like already they've been partying till like 3 a.m. or something ridiculous.
Yeah.
So then they're like, you need to go bathing. Like, they're just jesting with him, but he doesn't understand that it's really fully a jest. So he goes out and he does
the Feast of the Redeemer.
The Feast of the Redeemer, yeah. So he has this like sacred bath, and in that moment, he didn't have anything but his bathing suit. He sent the gondolier back after he's about to have this bath in the ocean, and he's with all the locals. He's with everyone, and it's kind of like, again, we get this sea picture of this, like, maybe this is like the shrimp finally swimming, right? Swimming free by himself without the attachment of the anemone around. And he comes out and he doesn't have any money to give. All of a sudden, he doesn't have this money to offer.
Yeah.
He only has himself, and he's strikingly surprised by the generosity of people, the kindness of people.
Someone gives him a ride back on a gondola, like no expectation of fee.
And the ruminations kind of stop. Yeah. And this courage comes from somewhere where he's like, oh, I don't need this. Like, there's these like twinkles of glimmers of moments. And this was one of the biggest one where you're like, oh, was this the epiphany he needed to like realize he doesn't need to please everyone with his money all the time?
Yeah.
And
and that was really powerful. And what was very disturbing, I found, at least personally, was when in the third book, when he manages to kind of bring Hilda back from the abyss in a way. Mm-hmm. The first, almost like the next thing that she says half an hour later is almost like, you have to shave your mustache off. It doesn't look good. You have to do this. You have to do that. Promise me you're going to do this. Promise me you do this. And at first you get Eustace's pushback. He's like, no, I don't want to do that. I feel like I look like a handsome officer. I got a compliment on my mustache. I reminded someone of so-and-so. No, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do this. And eventually submits and again falls back into that old
as soon as Hilda becomes well.
As soon as she becomes well. And in a strange way, like I guess what you were saying was this idea of like this codependence where one of them has to be the savior, one of them has to be like the rescuer. And it switched around when Hilda was ill.
Yeah, so he became a little bit more strong in his own way. Like he started to take on a bit more of the characteristics of Hilda, where he grew this mustache, and his aunt said he looked like his father, and that made him proud. And then...
But no, there was the officer of some sort.
And his aunt.
Oh, and an aunt as well? Yeah.
She was the first one to say it looked like her father. It looked like his father.
Okay.
And there's, again, this idea that his interaction even with his aunt, for example, changes, where he's not trying to please her as much. He's becoming, like, less interested in her opinion of him.
Yeah.
Less engaged in trying to... Before, he'd always try to change the way he approached her in order to please her, and she just didn't respect it. And then at one point, she even says, I like this new gentleman in front of me with a mustache. It makes you more of a man, kind of thing. And then it's just really sad to see that the change quickly happen after that, where it's like there's something about his relationship with Hilda that she just didn't know how to let go of him in a way, let go of that control of him, especially when, like, she started to let go as well when she had Dick, right? And so in that time, they both were kind of independent without needing one another. And then as soon as this catastrophe happened, it kind of forced them back into that codependent relationship.
Yeah, they were always in, even when they were distant from one another, living their own lives. There was still that tenuous connection.
But there's glimmers of moments where you're like, oh, they see part of, especially Eustace. Oh, you see part of, the part of you that you might be more successful at something like writing a book, for example, and he even sends it to someone and gets it accepted into a publisher, and and then it's like quickly dismissed by Hilda once she gets better, and anyway.
One thing I should just say as well, it's like there's a lot of soliloquies, like a lot. So sometimes it's frustrating to read. First off, it's frustrating to read because Eustace and Hilda, they're such real characters. They really feel like an aspect of yourself you can see in them, and I identified it, and I think we both identified like a lot of our aspects in them. But he really falls into these states of rumination, and these soliloquies, especially with his guilt consciousness, and especially when he's like really guilt stricken, and he starts to imagine these ideas or these fanciful sort of like encounters with characters, and how he's
It's
going
almost
to
like
he
has an event.
yeah
He has the event that happens that gives him stress for whatever reason. He's afraid he disappointed someone, whatever.
yeah
He replays that event first in a catastrophic lens, so it's like, oh my gosh, like everyone's gonna kind of die and things are gonna fall apart, and then he quickly changes it so that he becomes the hero. So he plays this like very long story out in his head, like clearly anxiety, right? It's like catastrophic thoughts and then become the rescuer. So he kind of teaches himself to cope in his own way, but it's the ruminations are really long.
Yeah,
the
but
soliloquies
exactly.
are long.
They're long, but as a reader, it's also very jarring because you're like, you're not sure what's real, what's actually just in his imagination. Is this his thought? Is this actually happening? So there are elements that can be a little bit, I don't want to say unsettling, but like, a little bit difficult to sometimes follow.
I think what's genius, it's both what's frustrating and what's genius about his writing. It's
absolutely.
Like, if you've ever struggled with rumination,
yeah,
it literally, like, maybe that's why we both, in a way, have struggled with this in our life. So it's like, when we go there, we're like, oh my god, this is like me reliving the hell that I've lived in, right? And so like, but then at the same time, it's like genius because you're like, this is literally what it feels like to ruminate on and on and on and on and on and on.
And the last book is pretty much mostly psychological and in the head of Eustace.
Yeah.
Not a lot of action happens. There isn't very many even like dialogue among the characters. It's a lot of his impressions of Venice, a lot of his own thoughts, a lot of his ruminations. So but I don't want to downplay this. This was an amazing book. Yeah. It was really unique. I feel like in many of the stories that we've read, this had like a depth and a subtlety, and it was deeply psychological. And I think I'm glad we read it.
Yeah, if you want to understand like someone who struggles with rumination or codependence, like you're gonna live through it with them.
Yeah, and even just to see like a wonderful like how a relationship between a brother and sister evolve over
and
their
how
lives.
It can be like both. Like love can be both, and there's many moments that are really beautiful where it's like protective in a way that is beautiful. Like Hilda can be incredibly protective and wonderful in a way Eustace isn't capable of. And so you see the beauty of that, and then you also see the downfall of it too. And
hence Emily Bronte's "I've known 100 kinds of love, all made the loved one rue."
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a tragic ending. It's a sad ending, but
it leaves you feeling like sad because you're attached to the characters.
Yeah, but wonderful work. It's a masterpiece, absolutely. How would you rate this out of 5?
Yeah. I kind of like swashbuckling adventures. So it's interesting because it's like I like a balance between the both. Like
we're gonna read The Count of Monte Cristo again I guess.
Yeah. I like the balance between action and psychological. I think this was like very heavy psychological to the point where like I felt angry at times.
And so I feel constricted a little bit sometimes.
Which is the purpose of it, I think, in some ways. So I'm gonna give it like a 4.3.
Yeah, I'd say 4.3 is what
out of 5. Yeah,
I would give it the exact same. Yeah, I think that's a very good.
Definitely worth reading. Absolutely. Yeah. And like I said, there's no other book that I can say that can quite capture rumination in the same way, like at all.
Yeah.
So.
And beautiful imagery. I really love the Edwardian period, and so does Ava. So and like really like the manners and the aesthetic, even the descriptions of Venice. I found it was all so very beautiful.
And the innocence and the like, the real like innocent. How do I say, like love that Eustace has, and like the childish like, way he just wants to please people is really quite beautiful. Actually, it's like as much as it can get heavy with the rumination, it's
something you want to
shows how much like you understand. But then that also helps to understand in a way why Hilda and some of these other characters around him are so cold. Like the irony is like you almost have to be because you can't get caught in that rumination. It's too much.
Yeah.
So like you understand. It's a great interplay of why that relationship happens in the first place and why it becomes like continues as it is.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us this evening. It was really a pleasure to have you here. Just so you know, we have a few books that we've also finished over this period of time.
Hopefully we'll be more active again.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll be sure to tune in. We'll be having a few more videos down the chute, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, have a good evening. We'll see you next time. Ciao, ciao.